Hello and welcome to the Climate Justice and Rights of Future Generations podcast, a podcast series brought to you by alumni from the Human Rights and Democratization in Africa Master's Program at the Center for Human Rights. We discuss climate-related challenges but also solutions in Africa. Make sure you listen all the way through. Let's green it!
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the third episode of the first series of the Climate Justice and Rights of Future Generations in Africa podcast. This podcast series is an initiative of Center for Human Rights HRDA program, Taskforce on Climate Change and Rights of Future Generations in Africa. Today, we will be discussing climate change-related displacement in Africa, and we will be hearing from two speakers. Both of them are human rights lawyers and alumni of the Center for Human Rights HRDA program. Our first speaker will be Zanele Fengu. Zanele has a keen interest in human rights and particularly on refugee law and climate justice. She's currently working as a legal researcher at Corruption Watch, the South African chapter of Transparency International. Her work focuses on land and mining rights as well as governance and leadership. Zanele, can you say hello?
Hi, Samri. Hi, Mosu. And hi to all the listeners. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Our second speaker is Mosupatsila Nare. She has previous experience at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and currently she's working as program manager at Women's Institute for Leadership Development. It's a Zimbabwean civil society organization focusing on women's empowerment and active participation in leadership and governance processes, including climate justice. And I'll be referring to her as Mosu. Mosu, can you say hello?
Thank you, Samri, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be part of this crucial discussion of our time. Thank you.
Great to have you here with us. And introducing myself now, I'm Samrawit Getaneh, or Samri. I'm a Senior Child Rights Protection Officer at the Secretariat of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and also a part-time PhD researcher at the University of the Western Cape, where I'm researching climate justice for African children. So in today's session, our presenters will be discussing how climate change interacts with various types of displacements and movements of people in Africa, and the various legal frameworks that are responding to this issue. The aim will be to highlight key challenges, but also identify recommendations. Without any further ado, I would like our first speaker, Zanele, to kickstart the discussion by perhaps explaining how climate change interacts with displacements in Africa in various ways. Zanele, you have the floor.
Thank you, Samri. Absolutely. So I think by now we're all familiar with climate change and all the ways that it manifests. So we constantly hear of flooding or droughts in one area of the world or another. But what we're seeing right now is that conflict-induced displacement, which is what the world and our legal frameworks had been used to up to this point, is fast being overtaken by climate-induced displacement. And how this happens is that you have people's homes or infrastructure which people rely on that's being damaged or wiped away by some catastrophic climatic event. Or another thing that we observe on our African continent in particular is subsistence farmers who, because of extreme weather conditions, because of extreme temperatures, or because of just unpredictable weather events, they are no longer able to live off the land as they previously did, because these are demographics who farm and live off the land, and that is their source of livelihood. But they're no longer able to do that in extreme climatic conditions. Something else that is quickly coming to the forefront is rising sea levels and coastal flooding that causes entire portions of land to disappear, much like the fictional underwater sea of Atlantis. So just to provide some stats on this and just to note, these are international numbers. It is quite difficult to pinpoint exactly what the trends are in Africa because there's very little research coming out on this. But worryingly, there are 570 coastal cities with a total population of over 800 million. Now, these populations in these cities are at risk of literally being wiped away as we continue to see sea levels rise and coastal flooding become a normal occurrence. It's speculated that by the year 2050, we will see much of these cities disappear.
Thank you, Zanele, for laying out this general introduction to the topic. And I'm picking up on what you said regarding the data, the issue of data, that we have global data on, for example, displacements resulting from perhaps sea level rise. But when it comes to the African continent, to what extent do we have data and statistics on climate-related displacements? Mosu, would you care to say a few things about that?
Yes, thank you, Samri. So as Zanele has highlighted, climate-induced displacement is a global crisis, and Africa has not been spared, and the statistics will reveal how big of a challenge it is. A 2024 joint report by the African Union Commission and the International Organization for Migration highlights that climate-induced disasters are among the major drivers of displacement in Africa, together with conflict and violence. According to the Africa Migration Report of 2024, in 2022, climate shocks led to the displacement of 7.4 million people across Africa, a very concerning increase from the 4.3 million in 2020. So these displacements were as a result of disasters, including floods, droughts, windstorms, and wildfires raging across the continent. 7.4 million people who have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their identities. It really cannot be business as usual. In Southern Africa, Cyclone Freddy internally displaced around 500,000 persons in Mozambique, Malawi, Madagascar, Mauritius, and Zimbabwe in 2023. Also, reports show that in 2022, in West and Central Africa, a total of 1.2 million people were displaced as a result of disasters, mainly due to floods, mostly in countries bound to the Atlantic Ocean. In the Horn of Africa, internal displacements more than doubled in 2022 as the region experienced its longest and most severe drought on record. So you see, even in Africa as a whole, millions more are moving in the context of the adverse effects of climate change. With a projected 1.7 degree global warming by 2050, a minimum of 17 to 40 million people could migrate internally in Africa due to water stress, reduced crop productivity, and rising sea levels. So from the current and projected statistics on displacement due to climate-related disasters, it comes to light that the African continent is indeed faced with a crisis. It then becomes important for swift action to be undertaken to address this state of affairs towards safeguarding the rights of future generations.
Thank you, Mosu. Clearly, the trend is that there is the level of displacement is increasing and doubling and even tripling, listening to the numbers you mentioned, every year. And I'm wondering, to what extent are these movements taking place within the borders of countries, and to what extent they are crossing international border, and how's that looking like in the continent? Zanele, if you may intervene on that.
Sure. So I'm sure we can all agree that displacement itself is already so devastating, but it just becomes even more of an issue and even more convoluted when we consider cross-border displacement, because now this becomes an issue that transcends international boundaries and international borders. So this is a field of law where migration law, refugee law, nationality law, all of that sort of converges, comes together. And at this point, these different areas of the law still don't speak to each other and still don't find much agreement in the existence of climate refugees. Are they economic migrants or are they climate refugees? And each of those terminologies or each of those labels come with different levels of protection. So for instance, an economic migrant is somebody who's seen to have left their country of origin purely by choice. Yet a climate refugee would be somebody who's considered to have left due to displacement and had no choice whatsoever, and by virtue of that is entitled to legal protections under international law and many domestic regimes. So what we're seeing currently is that a lot of our jurisdictions are lacking in as far as recognizing this fast-growing demographic, and a lot of our jurisdictions are lagging behind. And this has a real impact in the lives of people who are affected by this. As it stands, nobody nowhere, even international law does not recognize climate refugees as a protected group. Climate disaster is not one of the three grounds upon which one can apply for refugee status. So climate refugees are not recognized. And it becomes particularly devastating when we consider that this places people, regular people, women, children, disabled persons, just everybody really at risk of grave human rights violations. But we can get into that later.
Yes, that's indeed concerning that the legal framework is not keeping up with the emerging issues that are related with climate displacement. That's definitely leaving large segments of society unprotected, people on the move unprotected. And as Mosu also noted before, we now have a situation where conflict, violence, and climate shocks are equally the lead causes of displacements in the continent. So if we don't have any recognition for those who are being displaced by climate and moving international borders, crossing international borders, if they're not covered by the protection, then we definitely have a precarious situation, and the need for legal frameworks to keep up is even more intense. Perhaps Mosu, now you can speak a bit about the existing legal frameworks. We have heard that there's already a lack and a gap, but what else is there that is protecting actually people on the move due to climate change?
Thank you, Samri. So taking into account the African perspective, the African Union is the continental body that fosters the integration of African states, including in the areas of migration management, on climate change action, and disaster management. So numerous cross-cutting African Union policy frameworks are relevant to addressing human mobility in the context of disasters and the aspects of climate change. These policies address issues of protection, assistance, early warning systems, and the nexus between human mobility in the context of climate change. I'll draw your attention to the African Union revised migration policy framework for Africa of 2018. It reflects on the current migration in Africa. It states that environmental conditions, along with other factors such as insecurity and poverty, have been significant root causes of mass migration and forced displacement in Africa. So based on the MPFA, the African Union then adopted the Plan of Action for the Global Compact for Migration in Africa. This plan addresses the migration climate change nexus, calling for minimizing the adverse effects of climate change, disasters, and environmental degradation that compels people to leave their countries of origin. So also in 2009, the African Union adopted the Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, which is commonly known as the Kampala Convention. The Kampala Convention addresses internal displacement arising from a number of factors such as conflicts, development projects, as well as climate-induced displacement that we are talking about today. So the Kampala Convention has been held as the first ever legally binding instrument in the protection and assistance of IDPs, adopted at an opportune time when the African continent is faced with a growing displacement challenge. In particular, Article 5 of the Convention places an obligation on states to protect and assist internally displaced persons who have been displaced due to natural and human-made disasters, along with the provisions dealing with obligations of international organizations and responding to displacement. The Convention provides for humane treatment, for non-discrimination, for equality and equal protection of the law of internally displaced persons. It also provides for prevention of gender-based violence, access to information, and participation of displaced persons in finding sustainable solutions. Lastly, Article 9 provides that IDPs should be provided with humanitarian assistance, including food, water, shelter, health services, sanitation, education, and any other necessary social services. So now the question that remains is, has these instruments been translated to practice? Are displaced persons getting the protections as guaranteed by these instruments? And whether the state are actually fulfilling their obligations? So my co-presenter will touch on this when she delves into the human rights situation of displaced persons in Africa.
Yes, so you've laid out the level of protection, legal protection that we have. under the African human rights system. I think Zanele started by pointing out where the gap of protection lies when it comes to climate refugees, but we also have various other groups of people, such as internally displaced people, that are covered in these legal protections. We know for a fact that once these treaties are passed, they need to go through various steps and processes for them to translate into actual protection on the ground for individuals and people in general. So how is the situation on the ground, Zanele? What kind of human rights violations are taking place in relation to persons displaced by climate change in Africa?
So there's a number of international, regional, and even domestic legal instruments that are implicated here. And I guess ordinarily a number of rights that are implicated as well. So I guess most obviously we can look at environmental rights. We know that everybody has the right to a safe and clean environment, safe and clean drinking water, clean air, and all of that. And what we're observing in cases of climate displacement is that it's often accompanied by high levels of water pollution, high levels of air pollution that just make living there uninhabitable. Another group of rights that we're seeing violated are people's socioeconomic rights. So when infrastructure is washed away or wiped away or can no longer service the people, we see that people's rights to basic nutrition, to access to education, to access to shelter, and similar types of rights are violated and are not followed through with or cannot be catered to. And then finally, we also observe a number of political rights being implicated. So, for instance, this could involve people's cultural and linguistic rights. We need to bear in mind that when people are displaced, they are forced to leave land which they may have lived on for generations before them. People have loved ones and ancestors buried there and have real ties to their indigenous land. But when they're forced to leave, their political rights are implicated. We also, I guess, most obviously or all encompassing would be the right to human dignity, which is implicated when any of these rights violations occur. So really, it is a problem that plays out across multiple levels and is very devastating. And it's also important to bear in mind the intergenerational nature of these human rights violations. So we often hear it said that what happens today has implications for generations to come. But when we think about it practically, when a school is destroyed, that has bearing for not only those children who used to attend that school, but children who come from them or people who may have relied on them and so on and so forth. So it really does have a ripple effect, and it is very important to bear in mind the intergenerational nature of this problem.
Thank you, Zanele. You've touched upon various issues. I think we can discuss all of them for quite a long time, but two things came to mind, I think, as you're mentioning the violations. One is we speak, and today also we've spoken a lot about how climate change results in displacement. But also I think it's worth mentioning that climate action itself could result in displacement, because we have, just as one example, one climate action that is meant to protect carbon sinks is this conservation of large forests and wetlands and different carbon sinks that we have currently on the continent. And this, when being done without being mindful of human rights, when we're not using a human rights-based approach, it ends up displacing indigenous communities, people who rely on the land for subsistence, but also, like you said, Zanele, who have close ties with the land, and this also results in violation of many of their rights. So just to mention that climate action itself results in displacement if not done in a human rights-based approach. But also another issue you mentioned, this aspect of intergenerational impact. And I do feel like sometimes when we talk about intergenerational issues, we tend to only think about future generations, or people who are not yet born, and it always comes with this complicated legal questions about do they have rights. One thing I wanted to mention here is that future generation also includes children of today who will bear the worst consequences. So they do have rights. Children have rights today, and their rights are not only limited to what happens in their lives today, but the long-term best interest, because we have this principle of the best interest of the child that looks at also the long-term best interest. So intergenerational issues should also be based on, in addition to future generations who are here today, African children who will bear, who are currently bearing the brunt of the crisis, but also who will face the worst consequences later. After having said that, I know that we have touched on a lot of issues, but it's not possible for us to delve into all of them in detail. We can only highlight now. I would like to come back to both of you for recommendations, call to actions, and interventions. Perhaps I can start with Mosu.
Thank you, Samri. So just like Zanele has highlighted, displaced persons in Africa are faced with vast human rights violations, including their environmental, socio-economic rights, and political rights, amongst others that were mentioned. So given this discussion, I'm going to highlight some proposed interventions in addressing climate change and climate-related displacement in Africa. So firstly, there is a need for African states to prioritize the implementation of the various frameworks, including the Kampala Convention, in protecting persons who are displaced due to climate-related disasters. Given how urgent the matter is, it really is time to move from all talk and instruments on paper and ensure that the same are alive in practice and the rights of the affected are actually upheld. Also, the Kampala Convention must be ratified and domesticated as a matter of urgency across member states of the African Union. Further, policies should also be crafted to encourage businesses to prioritize investments associated with low to zero carbon emissions. In the short term, companies must be required to conduct environmental and climate impact assessments in their operations and exercise human rights due diligence, and also report on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change impacts. Lastly, there's also need for a commitment from the business sector to adopt environmental awareness and climate friendliness as the default of their operations, so as to safeguard the rights of future generations in curbing climate change and climate-related displacement.
Zanele, any additional recommendations?
Yes, all I would add to that list is that it's important to bear in mind that conservation can no longer be seen as an option. I think we're in too deep and we've come too far for that to still be the logic. We do need all hands on deck, and we need meaningful participation of all sectors of society, because this is everyone's problem and it is everyone's responsibility. Over and above that, we need civic action. We need communities and civil society organizations to come on board, and especially civil society organizations who are often the mouthpiece of the most vulnerable in our societies. We need them to be speaking and representing the needs and the interests of the most vulnerable, who unfortunately are often excluded from the places and the spaces where these conversations occur. Lastly, we need investment from government and from business. We need people to walk the talk and place their money where their mouth is. We need proper investment in early warning detection systems and preventative technologies as far as this is concerned all across the continent. But lastly, Samra, I would add that it's important to bear in mind that this is everyone's responsibility. This is our planet, which we all live on. And like I said earlier, it's just all hands on deck at this point, and we've come too far for this to still be an option.
Yes, I would like to use your words saying all hands on deck. I think that's quite a strong recommendation or call to action, because we are seeing how this issue of climate change is interconnected with many other challenges, and it has been described as a threat multiplier because it affects all sectors and issues, and it interacts with many other protection challenges. And so definitely all hands on deck and meaningful participation are going to be recommendations that will cut across not just our discussion here today, but throughout this series talking about climate justice and the rights of future generations in Africa, as these topics are very much interconnected. And just to remind our listeners, if you haven't done so, please listen to our previous episodes where we did a general introduction to climate change and human rights in Africa, but also we delved into the issue of children's rights and climate change and how children in Africa are specifically affected by climate change. And stay tuned for future episodes on more thematic areas. I would like to, again, thank you very much, Mosu and Zanele, for today's discussion. It's been a pleasure for me, and hopefully our listeners were able to take a few points from our discussion today.
This was a podcast episode brought to you by the Human Rights and Democratization in Africa Alumni Taskforce on climate justice and rights of future generations in Africa. We take this opportunity to acknowledge the financial support of the European Union through the Global Compass for Human Rights. Have you enjoyed it? You'd like to share your green story? You have an opinion to give? Reach out to us. Follow us on the HRDA Alumni Facebook page and Twitter account and share our podcast episodes. Let's work towards a sustainable future for all.